everyone. Thank you, Betsy. As you might have heard, recording has started. Welcome, everyone. Welcome to today's workshop, which is helping your nonprofit thrive, succession planning, and executive transitions. We're expecting a full house today. As I've already mentioned, we will be recording this session and we'll be sending a link to the recording and a brief survey as well after this session. So look out for that in your emails. My name is Yvette Bello and I'm representing the Hartford Foundation for Public Giving today. With me today is Betsy Johnson and Monica Kelly of the Hartford Foundation, and our co-host, Daniel Alexander from the Hartford Public Library. This workshop is brought to you by a partnership between the Hartford Public Library and the Hartford Foundation for Public Giving. So welcome. We do want to know who you are, so please take a moment and make sure that you just add your name and organization, and if you can, your title in the chat. Again, those are fun to read, and we'd like to see who's in the room. Typically how we will answer questions. This presenter has specific times for question and answers, and you'll somewhere around halfway mark, probably hour one, we'll break for some questions. You can at that point unmute and ask your question out loud, or feel free to use the chat and let me know so that I can elevate it to the presenter and ask the presenter. A survey I had mentioned earlier, we will be sending a survey after this session. We will also place the link to the survey towards the end of this session. So please feel free to fill it out. Let us know how we did, what you liked, what you'd hope to see in the future, and how we can improve. It really, really is helpful for us. There will be a break, like I mentioned, about an hour in. And we will announce that. But if you need a break, please feel free to take one. Without further ado, I'd love to introduce our presenter today is Cathy Cohen of CJ Cohen and Associates. For many years, Cathy has served as a consultant to for-profits and nonprofit clients, and has worked with organizations to maintain stability and shepherd growth. I love that language, by the way. Cathy's areas of expertise include strategic planning, marketing, capacity building, organizational transitions and assessments, executive searches, board development, and communications. In her work with nonprofit boards and staff, she identifies opportunities for organizational transformation. She works especially closely to help organizations experience growth in the areas of community impact, social justice, and diversity. For the past 12 years, Cathy has also served as a transition consultant and interim executive director in a variety of nonprofit in fields including healthcare, education, homelessness, supportive housing, news and media, and community development. She addresses many critical needs of a nonprofit organization, including staff relationships, contract oversight, community engagement, board communications, and financial issues, including fundraising and development. Cathy is also a very trusted consultant with our own Hartford Foundation for Public Giving Building on Success program, and has been in its growth since its inception. This program, the Building on Success program, is focused on supporting smaller nonprofits increase their effectiveness in their core nonprofit functional areas. Cathy is from Northampton, Massachusetts, and holds an MBA from the University of Massachusetts Amherst. Please join me in welcoming Cathy Cohen. Cathy, welcome.
Thank you, Yvette. Thanks so much. Good morning, everybody. I'm really glad to be with you here today. These are two subjects that are very near and dear to my heart. And I do want to say that as we start a discussion of succession planning and executive transitions, I just want to say that we're also talking about the long-term sustainability of an organization, its ability to thrive in the face of change. We know that change is a constant in our world. And as we know, if the past year is any example, we can't always predict how or when change will test us as an organization. And whether your organization is a small one, a medium-sized, or a large one, whether you have a really small staff or a very large staff, hopefully there's something for you to take away from this presentation. I recognize a lot of you may not be in the position to create a succession plan yourself. Hopefully by the end of the presentation, you'll understand the rationale for creating one, which is really our main goal here. We can go to the next slide. So our goals I've listed for this session really are that you will learn how a succession plan can strengthen your nonprofit, no matter how old your organization is or how large or small. You'll learn about the 3 basic types of succession planning. You'll be in a position to initiate an emergency succession plan, or if again, you're not in the position to do that yourself, you may be able to help initiate one or advise your executive director, your board president. And you'll learn about the 3 phases of an effective executive transition for a nonprofit organization. And the next slide, please. So as was mentioned before, if you have questions or comments, you can type them in the chat box and we'll take some time to respond to these just before the short break midway through the session. And again, as time allows at the end of the session. And as Yvette mentioned, if you would please mute your screen until you want to speak, that'd be great. So the next slide, we have a poll question. What I'd love to know is who's in the room just in terms of your position in your organization. So if you could respond to the poll question, we'll have a sense of where you sit in your organization. Great, this is really helpful. It's great to have a diversity of people in the room and also to have so many people who actually are in a position to create a succession plan. Executive directors and board members, will certainly take something different away from this session. Thank you. So we can move on to the next slide. And if we can maybe take the poll off. So preparing for an executive transition is one of the big reasons why we do succession planning. And your organization's succession planning efforts and your organization's bench strength pave the way for an executive transition, whether planned or unplanned. So the connection between succession planning and executive transitions has a lot to do with the idea of bench strength, which I'd like to talk about for a second. So the next slide is about bench strength. What does it mean? And how does it apply to your nonprofit organization? For the next slide, please. Have you ever watched a really competitive soccer game, maybe a couple of highly ranked college teams playing against each other? You watch a while and the players just knock themselves out, do a great job, and they play really hard. But then sometime during the game, a few start to get kind of winded and maybe a little exhausted. And one player might miss a pass. Another might stumble while they're running. The coach decides time to bring in a player or two from the bench to replace the ones who are wearing thin on the field. What a concept, having team members completely ready to take over. They're energized, they're happy to run onto the field. It's actually the bench strength for a team, and it means the team has the capacity to move forward with skill, and they're ready, and they have the energy to take over even when things on the field look a little bit shaky. That's a lot about strategic planning and succession planning rather, and bench strength is a term we can also apply to a nonprofit organization. If an organization has bench strength, it has team members, staff and board members too, who are prepared professionally and personally to step up and take charge, managing some part of the organization, its programs, its finances, or current projects, maybe HR, or overall management, because they have thought through what it means to do that and they're prepared to. It's that advanced preparation that we're talking about that's at the heart of succession planning. And so, as we said, change is constant for a nonprofit organization, whether it's your environment, whether it's funding resources, or the dwindling capacity you find you have to meet the needs of your mission, or sudden staff turnover. I mean, these changes happen often, and they require some readiness to deal with them and manage them. It's a great advantage if you're prepared in that way. So today we're focusing on the particular issues you find when an executive director or senior leader leaves your organization. In this kind of change, the concept of bench strength is fundamental, since building leadership capacity throughout your organization will help you prepare for it. So in a few minutes, we're going to do a short exercise that asks you to think about your own organization's bench strength and how you might handle an executive transition. Next slide. So most nonprofits are hierarchical, as you know. Management decisions and activities start at the top and they filter down through the organization. And it is the executive director or the CEO who is responsible really for the organization's success, for how well it adheres to the mission, for its financial stability, staff management, fund development, community and donor relations, and more. Senior staff are often stretched thin these days. Many do more than one job, but often their real skills and their abilities and their capacity to develop professionally may mean that they are underutilized, in fact. As we know, most nonprofits are pretty committed to community empowerment, whether it's a homeless shelter or a mental health or addiction support organization, advocacy organization, or any other type of nonprofit. So it can be a natural extension of this ideology to empower staff as shared leaders. It aligns with the social justice values most nonprofits proudly claim. So the next slide has what are some obstacles to succession planning? You might have a very small staff, which means you don't have a lot of capacity. Budget constraints might mean you can not really offer major professional development to all your staff. Your board may not recognize how important it is to do succession planning. And some executive directors see it as a little threatening. If you're doing succession planning, it means you want me to leave, and that's not necessarily the case at all. I have this little exercise that I thought would be helpful because I think there's a lot of intelligence in this room and a lot of insight, and I'd like to call that forward. So the next slide says, how does succession planning relate to an executive transition? This exercise is asking you in about 5 minutes to answer these 3 questions. If your executive director or CEO suddenly were to leave, how do you think the staff would feel or react? How might the board react? And please list 3 or 4 things you can imagine happening as a result of this. And we'll just take a few responses after you do this. So we'll take 5 minutes. Some people, love to hear from some of you about your thoughts on the first question. If your executive director or CEO suddenly left, how do you think your staff would react or feel? Anybody want to volunteer what they thought?
I will share that Rosalind Swift in the chat did share that they would be in a bad position, that no one is there to take the executive director's position.
Okay, we have somebody else, Catherine. I do not have a working microphone, so here's mine. A board and members would be saddened and wonder how they will be able to fill the hole left by such a competent and productive leader. Great, thank you. Other people who want to just put something in the chat box, that's fine.
I know for us at Connecticut's, we also would feel very stressed and, you know, maybe a little sad. We'd definitely be sad, but I think for us, the stressed is the most word that I can think of. We have we're very small, so there's about 15 of us, or maybe less than 20 of us. That's including staff and board members. And so we're a very small organization. And so a lot of us, we do try to make sure that everyone knows a little bit of everything. But as the executive director, you know, she is in charge, or has to have the responsibility of making sure that she knows most of the things. And that is something that, you know, I would most likely have to be the interim person if that was to happen. And I would not feel comfortable because I don't know everything. So stress is the word that I could think of.
Thank you, Kira. That's great. Anybody else have some thoughts?
I think one thing would be fear.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah, very often it's a traumatic time for staff. They're very confused. They're very upset. They think there might be some threat to their position. There are all kinds of things that change when a leader leaves. And how about the board? How do you think the board might react?
Mhm.
I mean, I know we have a lot of board members in this room.
I think there would be some anxiety there, anticipating the magnitude of the task that lies in front of them, that you know, getting organized and getting going would probably be a stressor.
Right. Anybody else have a thought?
Yeah, I was going to say that that not as much would get done or efficiently get done. I think in our case, our board members would step up as best they can, but I can just imagine because of the lack of knowledge, because they don't know. When I took over, I knew nothing, and it took me a year to figure it out. So yeah, just a kind of a digression of how well things run with someone who's been there a while.
Yeah, board members would rush to take over things that they might not know enough about. And even finding the right files and the right connections with people who, you know, do audits or investments. I mean, there's a lot of things that are not clear to all board members immediately. So definitely. Any other things people want to say?
I would also like to add that I think our board would be a little worried, because I do know that as I shared for myself, I would probably become like the interim person, but I know I definitely would not want to take the executive director role. And there's other people, you know, the other executive team members, I don't think any of us really would want to transition into the executive director.
Right.
So trying to find someone outside of the organization to be the new director, I think is something that would be a little scary for them. Our last 2 to 3 transition of executive directors, it's always gone to someone who's already been in the position, someone who's typically been in my position, the position I'm in. Usually that person then becomes the next executive director.
Right.
But that's something that I've already shared that I'm not willing to do. And so I think if our executive director was to leave suddenly now, that transition of trying to find someone outside of the organization would be
Right.
a lot.
Yeah, the last question that I asked you was list 3 or 4 things you can imagine happening. And I don't know if anybody has any thoughts about that, but one of the things I've seen happen very quickly is that funding gets held back, that there's confusion among clients, partners, funders. Sometimes there's unwanted media attention. All kinds of things can happen at that time that really impact your organization. There's a sense of nobody home. There's a sense of, you know, how is this organization going to cope now and what are they doing? So there's a real burden on the communication staff to really get messages out that keep rumor mills from functioning and creating things that aren't true.
Great. We have a couple more comments in the chats. Cathy, would you like me to read them?
Yes, please.
Awesome. Cynthia said she also is having an issue with her volume, but she knows that when the prior director had left, it took many months to fill the position. The relationship with the board, staff, and constituents is also a key factor. Lisa Hutkins added, as a board chair, I feel members would look to the chair for answers. This is why the board chair needs to do the research necessary to get the process going. So some prevention there.
Great comment.
Should we come to the right place? Catherine Kosiba wrote second bullet B, it might take some time for the board to pull together to take the needed steps for their interim handling of the vacancies responsibilities, as well as pursue of a replacement. At the present time, our nonprofit club organization members are very reluctant to take on or commit to leadership roles because of their busy lives, other responsibilities. Every 2 years, we have a challenge to fill 4 officer positions and annually committed chairs. Also she added for bullet C, which is your last question, Cathy, significant concern about the future of the organization by members, difficulty finding a replacement, and how to handle the different responsibilities in the meanwhile, which is 3 or 4 things she can imagine happening. Dwayne wrote, added, I can imagine staff turnover. Very real.
Yeah, these are great comments and they're absolutely on target. I think you're all expressing the reason why we do succession planning and why it's an important thing, not only for your staff, but for your board as well. I mean, some of you who mentioned difficulty in filling board roles, a lot of boards don't do a lot of succession planning for their own positions. And that's also something that, you know, becomes a part of the whole process of succession planning. This is great. Thank you for all your thoughts. I'm going to move on to the next slide, which is actually another
Cathy,
exercise. Yes.
Lori had her hand up.
Oh, I'm so sorry.
Nope, that's okay.
Lori.
That's okay. Thank you, Monica. But if you want to move on, Cathy, it's okay. I was
No,
actually
please.
just going to offer, my organization is probably best a case study for why succession planning needs to be done. We had a founder, my organization is fully volunteer. It was a founder and a board and volunteers. And when the founder stepped down, the board continued, but they didn't do any succession planning and they had difficulty bringing people in. And when I was the first live body to show up, they were like, great, you're here, it's yours. So there was a lot of rebuilding to be done, but you know, I've still been at a place where, is this worth continuing? You know, it's really having to build from the ground up. And honestly, it was never my, you know, this wasn't an organization I founded. This wasn't something I was fully vested in. I showed up as a volunteer and it kind of got dumped on me. And so fortunately, it's for education. It's supporting our students and our community. So it's something that's important to me, but it's really hard to keep it going.
Yeah, I think you make a lot of really good points, Lori. And I think we're going to get into that more about the whole executive transition process a little bit later, but absolutely some preparation, important preparation wasn't happening.
Right.
So thank you for sharing that. So we have on the next slide, we're going to move on. How does a shared leadership help an organization? And this exercise, it says 10 minutes, but we're just going to take 5 to list 3 or 4 ways you think shared leadership might help your organization. And maybe you can think through, no matter what size your organization is, how this might help you. Because shared leadership can be not only with your staff, but it can be outside the organization too. Shared leadership sometimes brings community members in as well. So maybe just take 5 minutes. We'll think, 3 or 4 ways you think shared leadership could help you.
Sure can, Cathy. Okay. Claude Mayo shared sharing of 1, organizational knowledge and operation, 2, fundraising relationships, and 3, transcend vision and pathway forward. Stephen Morris shared preparedness for unexpected events, more than 1 subject matter expert on certain organizational functions, and 3, helps train possible future leaders and helps staff build their skill sets.
Great.
These are really great. Dwayne, ease anxiety. Need I say more? And then Cynthia Howard, also still having issues with audio, but when she thinks of the shared leadership, she thinks more about having an associate director rather than having co-directors. The associate director position helps us in that people are more willing to speak with someone they know has decision-making ability. She doesn't see that co-director, executive director, as a feasible thing for our nonprofit, her nonprofit. In reality, she is an administrator of for the board who are actually leaders, my bosses. Jean Mertz wrote, "I think I work harder and better when sharing the load." Oh, that's great.
Great.
There are a few more. Would you like me to continue? Just
I guess what I want to say is that, you know, we've covered a lot of the waterfront, and I think that's fine. These are all really exceptionally good responses, and I think that's really all very important. What I want to say is that, you know, clearly we know some staff would be prepared to assume new duties in the absence of a senior leader. The board could also rely on some staff. We know that, instead of interrupting their lives to become management. The community would also learn through the media that someone was taking over senior leadership. But also, I think one of the most important things is that staff would begin to feel empowered and respected and responsible for the organization's future and their future well-being in ways that they might not have felt before. So sharing leadership really enables them to step up with more knowledge of the functional areas of the organization. It creates a very different culture in an organization, in addition to all the things that you all mentioned, which I think are all extremely important. Because of time, I think we should move on to the three phases of succession planning, but I really appreciate all of the responses you gave. They were great. So looking at these three phases, they're listed as phases because often they have this kind of logical sequence to them to engage in them. Numbers 1 and 2, strategic leader development, which is what we've been talking about, and emergency succession planning, are activities that your organization could do right now. The third one, departure defined succession planning, really is the only one you would start when your executive director or your CEO tells you they have a fixed date for their departure. And at that moment, you would initiate a succession plan anticipating that departure date with more specificity. So the next slide is strategic leader development, which really enables your organization to look at its planning for the future and look at its staffing. You look at your existing skills within your organization and the experience as something that you could build on. Every nonprofit has some sort of strategic vision that directs how they're going to invest their resources and their time in the next year or two. Maybe to expand programs, maybe you're expanding geographically, or being more advocacy related in your efforts. They envision the future. And by bringing these two things together into alignment, your staff members' talents and your strategic vision, you get a sense of whether it's really an achievable vision. So the board chair of a nonprofit will usually ask, where do we want to be in 5 years or 10 years? How do we envision that future? And will the staff we have help us get there? Are we missing skills and experience? Can we work to develop the staff we have to become the staff we need for our own growth? Or do we need to hire others? Not that it's a simple thing to say we need to hire more people, obviously. But a plan for strategic leader development is one way to work towards succession planning and to follow a road to sustainability. And it's very involved with your strategic planning work. And again, it creates a culture that supports leadership development and succession management in your organization. So on the next slide, emergency succession planning. If we can move to the next slide. What if you have an unplanned executive director departure? And this is not as unusual as you might think. In an emergency, you need to be prepared for the unexpected, and your executive director might become ill or be involved in an accident. They may be asked to leave, or they may resign. There are many ways an unplanned departure can happen and can short circuit the work of an organization or create some real challenges. If you have an established emergency succession plan, you identify the needs in advance in a wide variety of functional areas. And it's different for every organization, but your own emergency succession plan can identify who can best manage these specific functional areas and prepare them to do that. And in the process, you'll be creating a more leaderful organization, one where there is professional growth available and development for your staff. The next slide, please. Important areas in an emergency transition plan. So suppose your own executive director resigned without warning or was fired. How can you plan ahead to maintain your organization's stability in this situation? So I have another exercise for you to please make a list of the 4 areas or functions you think would be of the greatest importance in a situation like this one. This would be to maintain the stability of the organization. And by functional areas, we're thinking of the major responsibilities of an executive director. What would happen if they were not there? In their absence, what would need to be done? And as I said, maybe different for each organization, but there will certainly be some overlap. So we're going to take 5 more minutes, and please think about this. What are the 4 areas in your own organization that would be most important? So 4 or 5 minutes is all we need. And one in the chat room already.
I could definitely take that one, Cathy. Catherine writes, in response to this question, we would need to continue our weekly staff meetings to promote continuity. Number 2, communicate frequently with our community to share positive insights. And 3, continue with all of our planned programs. 4, be sure to appoint someone as a voice for the organization who can answer any immediate concerns.
Great ones, absolutely.
I'm sorry, and that was Lisa. Lisa, sorry. Catherine wrote, sorry about that, Lisa. Catherine wrote, communication with organizations members, financial management, organizations' ongoing relationship with community partners, donors, others, organizational management, administration, manual, with all functions, responsibilities, documentation.
Great.
There are some others. Sandra wrote financial oversight, programming, staffing, and public relations. Cynthia wrote, I'm thinking about finances, overseeing monthly reports, statements, investments, clear communication, and reporting to the board, relationship maintenance with donors, and clear communications to staff, and known responsibilities for each.
Absolutely, great.
Yeah. Similar with Claude and Nicole, particularly around programmatic oversight, synchronization, legislative advocacy, community partner networking, board communication, and Nicole added finances, HR, and board relationships.
Yeah, these are all terrific. And there is a good bit of overlap. Was there another one?
Nope, that
No,
was
okay,
it.
That's great.
Can I say something? And I
Yes,
wanted
Rosalind.
and I wanted to ask, is it easier to raise your hand, put that little raise your hand up sign instead of typing? I probably
Sure.
would prefer
Either one.
sometimes to just talk than try to type. I'm not really a typist, but I had some of the similar ones that they had. And I think an important one would be knowing the responsibility and the job duties of that person, and definitely have it written down. And for us, because of what we do, we have to know our community and know the different agencies that we connect with and how we interact with one another.
Yeah.
So networking is very important, and knowing our community is very important. And then basically having a lot of written down processes that people would know and be able to go to.
Right. Yeah.
And ongoing training.
Yeah, thank you. That was great. Oscar.
I think somebody needs to be ready to make the decisions that really can't be made at any other level.
Yeah, for sure. These are all great. And I think that you've covered the waterfront pretty much on this as well. I think there's very little that you didn't mention. Financial management, staff management, development and fundraising, marketing communications, maybe program oversight, and maybe there's some major issue that faces the organization that somebody needs to handle. Sometimes there are critical moments in an organization, and when your executive director is gone, somebody has to make decisions like that. I was an interim director for an organization whose executive director walked out one morning, put her keys on the desk and said, "I'm out of here." And there was no warning that this person was leaving. There was no plan for it. Their major funder had a multi-$1,000, $200,000 check, I think, already waiting for them that was being held back because they could not understand how there was no plan for something like an emergency happening. So it's really important for your funders to know that you have a plan and that you are really prepared for any eventuality, even if it means we knew we'd have to hire from outside to take us through this difficult period. You may not have enough staff in-house to pick up everything, but you will have thought that through. So thank you for all of your thoughts about that. That's really great. The next one is departure-defined succession planning. And this is when you know that your executive director will be leaving. They've given you some notice and you have the time to plan ahead to ensure the sustainability of the organization. Sometimes you know months or even a year or 2 years ahead, and you have the time to really prepare. The departing leader plays a major role in this preparation. If you have an interim period after the executive director leaves and before a new leader is hired, you might need an interim person, and there might be a very smooth transition. If it's a year coming, you have time to really find and bring in a successor who meets the needs of the organization. So the functional areas we just talked about for an emergency transition plan will probably be similar until a new leader is hired. So a new part of this plan will include preparing and engaging stakeholders, letting your donors, funders, or foundations, community, legislators, as many of you mentioned, anyone with whom there's a close relationship, know what's happening in advance, well enough in advance that there's an intentionality about it. And of course, your departing executive director will have a major role in telling you when they're leaving and when this is happening. Some areas of special vulnerability that need attention at a time like this might be, as we were just talking before, anything that's about to happen, whether it's a new program that's just starting, a move to a new site, some impending financial crisis that you have to face, or some unresolved staff issues. These vulnerable areas need special attention at a time like this. And some organizations have time to resolve them before the person leaves, which is the best scenario. And then recruiting and supporting a successor who meets the future needs of the organization is of utmost importance. And we're going to be talking more about that as we move into the topic of executive transitions in a few minutes. I thought this might be a good time to stop and respond to questions for a little bit before we take a short break. And I don't know if we've had anybody send in any questions yet, or if anybody has any they'd like to either raise their hand and ask or put into the chat. Dwayne, you have to unmute yourself. Yeah.
I did. So is it safe to assume that although we're focused on the executive director, that the steps and the issues and the challenges that you're laying out here may also apply to other senior staff positions?
I think many of them would. I think it really depends, again, on the bench strength you have and whether there's more than one person in that department and in that area that can pick up the reins and take over. But a lot of these questions would be the same that you would ask. Do you have the bench strength to take over that person's role? And how much notice do you have? Do you have time to actually create some plan? But yeah, sure, very similar.
Thanks.
So I have an anonymous question here of how long in advance should an executive director actually inform an organization that they're leaving? And I think it's an interesting question. And certainly the more time an organization has, the better it is for the organization's sustainability, but the more precarious it may be for the outgoing executive director. There's nothing like a person who's on their way out, you know, to feel as if maybe they don't have the clout that they had before, or maybe they're not getting the respect they need. People know that they're leaving. It's certainly great to have 9 to 12 months in advance if you can, because it really gives you the time to do a thoughtful transition. That isn't always the case, and it isn't always possible, but the ideal, I think, would be to have almost a year ahead. Any other questions?
I would say just a comment, Cathy, on the portion of your presentation around emergency succession planning, and that you described identifying like a go-to person for each of the functional areas of the nonprofit's work. I thought that was, I don't know, I think I'm hearing it with new ears. I think that's like an aha for me, frankly, because it really just it spreads that responsibility, right? And then it makes, I think, the eventual transition of an executive director into that role just a little less daunting for both the incoming ED or whoever's rising to that position. For the board, I just felt like that was something I'd like to highlight, because I think that was a real aha for me.
Yeah, great. It's a great comment. And I think that that whole idea of shared leadership really implies that, you know, that is the culture you create, that you have people ready to pick up the reins and do the job. Yeah. Any other questions at this moment? There'll be time for questions again at the end. So please, if you have other questions and you want to save them, that's fine. We promised you a 5-minute break, and I think this is the time we would take that break. So I think we'll stop here and take a 5-minute break and see you in 5 minutes. We'll move forward. So the next slide is steps to prepare for an executive search. And this is, again, departure defined. You know that your executive director or your CEO is going to be leaving. And the very first thing to know is that an executive transition can be one of the most disruptive, one of the most unsettling and difficult times for any nonprofit organization. Whether your executive director is leaving voluntarily or is asked to leave, whether it's been expected or unexpected, no matter what it is, it's still a very difficult time. And whether that person has been there for a year or two or is your founder, they all present different scenarios of difficulty, but they all are disruptive and troubling for an organization. It can take many months to actually find a successor and bring somebody in and complete an executive search. But there are some immediate steps that organizations have to take that will help sustain the organization during this very important moment for the organization. So how do you start, and what are the components of a successful search? Who takes major responsibility for the work? The 3 items listed here are the starting point. You might need an acting or an interim executive director. If you have a year or more before the actual transition happens, you may be able to complete the search and actually introduce the new leader as the old leader is leaving. But in reality, sometimes you learn that your executive director is leaving 3 or 4 months before they leave. And what do you do then? It's often too short a time to hire a successor, and you often will need to have an interim leader. So at a time like this, an interim ED, whether it's in-house, somebody who is willing to step up and take that role, or you have to hire somebody from outside the organization, that role needs to be filled. And when it does, as we mentioned before, it's the kind of thing that you can plan in advance. You kind of know, even if it's a 3-month period of time that you have to make these plans, you know whether you have somebody in-house who can take on that role or you do not. Sometimes it's a board member, sometimes it's a staff person, and sometimes it's an outside person who's brought in with the skill to actually move into that interim role. And I myself and colleagues of mine are people who do that frequently, and so have a lot of ideas about how to hit the ground running when you come into an organization. It's also a traumatic time for staff, even if it's a planned transition. And keeping staff informed is one way to alleviate the stress. So identifying somebody, maybe the board chair or a board member, to communicate regularly with the staff keeps the rumor mill in check and offers real information to the staff, which they really appreciate. Typically, it's the board chair who will empower a search committee, who will decide who they'd like to be on that search committee. And usually it's a combination of board members, maybe a former board member, sometimes staff, usually 5 or 7 people. It's a very major commitment of time over the period of that 4 to 9 months. And so it has to be people who really have the wherewithal and the interest in being involved in that process. So next slide, please. What's an executive transition like? So as I mentioned, it's a very pivotal and vulnerable time for an organization because change is not a comfortable thing for most people. Some say it's one of the most difficult, most threatening times for any nonprofit. There's always an element of the unknown, and some staff may think that their jobs are in jeopardy, that they'll maybe be replaced. Some community members or funders, as we've been talking about, will need to know how things are being handled. They'll need some information coming to them, and they deserve to know. But it's also a time of terrific opportunity. And having done these executive transitions for a while, I have seen organizations come together and strategize in ways that they would not have done if this weren't the case. The board is tasked with looking ahead in a way that they hadn't in recent years necessarily. They may revisit the strategic plan, or they may begin a strategic planning process if they have a year ahead to really complete one, and determine what kind of leader they'll need. A lot of organizations will say, oh, we want somebody just like the person who's leaving. He's been great, she's been great. We really want to replace that person with somebody just like him or her. But in fact, that's the person who brought you where you are now. It's not the person who's necessarily going to take you to where you want to be 5 years from now. So there's a lot of effort made to think about the future and think about the kind of skills, the kind of experience, the kind of personal qualifications you need to get the organization from where you are now to where you're going. So if the process is well managed by the board, this can be a time of real growth and real positive change. And I've seen a lot of boards come together at a time like this in a way that's really highly functional. If it's not well managed, unfortunately, say the board does not take ownership of the process, there can be some very mixed results. And a new executive director might come into a somewhat dysfunctional organization. So it's the board who will remain in this oversight position, not the outgoing executive director. It is the board that sees the whole transition process through to its conclusion. So looking at the next slide, the 3 phases of the executive transition are these. And this is these 3 phases were really put together by Compass Point, a nonprofit support organization in California. And they've also been used very successfully by Third Sector New England, now called TSNE Mission Works in Boston. So prepare, search, and thrive. And we'll talk about each of these separately. So first, the prepare phase, which is on the next slide. This is a perfect time for soul searching. The organization really determines whether it needs to hire an outside interim leader or whether it has somebody in-house who can handle that. A transition committee or search committee has been appointed or empowered by the board chair. Again, usually 6 or 7 people, and they are the backbone. They are the real worker bees of the search process. Outside resources like a search consultant or a search firm can be a big help because there are so many details and so many jobs to be done in the process of doing this search and hire process. The details are really drafting a very high-level position profile, and position profiles are public documents that share the history of the organization, its accomplishments, the opportunities for the future. They're a little bit of a marketing piece to get the right candidates interested in the position. So they're crafted very carefully, in my experience, and they make a huge difference in the kind of candidate pool that is attracted to the position. The organization might need to hire an outside interim ED, especially if its executive director leaves suddenly. Next, many consultants will conduct an organizational assessment to determine the strengths and challenges the organization is facing right now. This would include confidential interviews with staff members, board members, and a variety of stakeholders to really get perspectives on the organization from outside and inside to share with the board. The results of the assessment will often confirm what the board already knows, but in many cases, it will share some new perspectives. And people are asked questions like, what kind of leader does this organization need next? What are the opportunities ahead for this organization? And you get different perspectives from staff, board members, and stakeholders on those questions, which are brought back to the board for them to consider. It helps them look at the future a little more clearly and also helps them determine the kind of person they're looking for to succeed their current executive director. So position profile is not a job description, but an overview of the organization's accomplishments and future opportunities. A search consultant will also work with the board and the search committee to identify the best means of finding those ideal candidates and getting the word out. What job sites should be used and which individuals should be contacted about the opening. And just as an interesting aside, there are what we call active job seekers and passive job seekers. And the active job seekers are the ones who are going to look at the job sites and be very interested in finding the right job. The passive job seekers are the ones who find out about it, although they're not seeking another job. They're happy in the position they're in, but when they find out about your opening, they think, that's the job I've always wanted. I'm willing to make a change. So we try to really reach both groups, the passive and the active job seekers. And that's what the outreach plan really does. It really tries to do both of those things. So it's a very major search process that really tries to share the information that this job is open with a lot of people. The next slide, please, the search phase. So if we've developed an outreach plan to attract the targeted candidates we're looking for, and my hope as a consultant to the process is to develop a strong, talented candidate pool with special attention to bringing in a broad and diverse candidate pool. We do this by getting the word out appropriately across many platforms. The consultant helps the search committee, though the search committee does a lot of the work, to screen candidates and decide whom to offer an interview. The screening really involves checking out whether you have candidates who've applied for 17 different jobs, and this is just one of them, as opposed to the people who are really, really interested in this particular position. And sometimes there are phone screen calls which try to determine that very fact. And the ones who rise to the top and seem like ideal candidates and very interested in the position are the ones who get interviewed. So at this point, when you have a candidate pool and you've identified the ones you wanted to interview, you've done the interviews and you have some top tier candidates that you're really interested in, it's really important for the departing executive director, the staff and the board to meet the few finalists who have risen to the top and give you their own assessment of the candidate's qualifications. What I found, and I think it's true universally, is that no board member really knows the executive director's position as well as the executive director does. So every finalist in this candidate pool needs to be able to ask questions of the departing executive director and get a real sense of the position and what the future holds for them if they take this job. Staff also need to give their feedback as well. They don't make decisions about the final choice, but their input is important to hear. And the search committee needs to know about it and the board needs to know about their views. And they may actually rank the finalists differently from the way the search committee does, but that's okay. You really want to hear from them. And I think they also need to be valued and respected enough to be introduced to the finalists. So usually there are 2 or 3 finalists who are asked for references, which are checked. Usually a top finalist is determined and then the board chair will make an offer to that person. So the next slide is the thrive phase. And we can go to the next slide. How can a consultant and board members help to ensure the success of the new executive director? Let's assume somebody has been hired. And I want to take another 5 minutes or so for you to think about this question. 3 or 4 ways that you think a consultant can support the new executive director during their first few weeks on the job. So we'll take a 5-minute break here. Do you want to volunteer?
We do have one was a question regarding where do we get guidance on human resources aspects, salary, nonprofit, ED, etc. In response to the exercise, we have the response from Catherine. Conduct an introductory. Please mute if you could. Conduct an introductory orientation to the orientation, arrange for individual meetings with key staff to meet, start to develop relationships, learn what each does and how to interact with the ED, provide resource manuals, documentation new ED will need. But if you have a question, you can totally use the raise hand feature and unmute. All right. Rosalind has a question.
I do. I wasn't really sure about the consultant. Is that a member of the organization? Is that an outside consultant that's doing it? Because I was thinking to myself that a consultant may not have an in-depth understanding of how the organization runs. They're more looking at just hiring someone to fill that position, but may not know about the organization. So is the consultant like an outside person or a part of the organization?
So the consultant is, if you hire a consultant to do the search with you, it's an outside person who takes a great deal of time understanding the organization. And as we were talking about, doing the organizational assessment and working with the board to find out where the organization is heading, what kind of person they need. It's not just a cookie cutter thing where you're just looking for someone to fill the seat. You really do a lot of work as an outside consultant to work with the organization. And it's many months of work to get to the point where you hire the right person. I want to just take a quick chance to respond to the question about the salary. I mean, I think salary information is available from the Council of Nonprofits, from Board Cafe, and from glassdoor.com. All of those organizations, if you go online and look, will have information about salary for your particular geographic location, for the operating budget that you have, and the size of the staff, and the kind of responsibilities of the executive director. So all of those things would really impact the kind of salary expected by a candidate for your position. Oscar, you had something else you wanted to share.
I would think it would be helpful if a few board members, maybe as staff, would go over the strategic plan if they have one in some detail and see what the response of the ED is.
Right. So we were looking at the consultant supporting the new ED, but also it's clearly the board that does a major amount of the work. Often it's the consultant that guides the board in what they have to do. So other thoughts people had? Rosalind, did you have something else?
Oh, I'm sorry. No.
No. Okay.
Well, I actually didn't get a chance to write down the information for the CEO salary.
Mm-hmm.
I
Oh,
didn't
okay.
get it. So I was asking the question.
Okay, so I'll just mention that again, Council of Nonprofits. And these are all, links online are easy to find. Board Cafe and glassdoor.com. And maybe we can put that in the chat at some point. So are there other thoughts people had about how to support the new ED in their first few weeks? You want to make sure they stay in the job. You want to make sure they're happy. So one of the things I have often done is help to clarify the board's expectations of them. So maybe putting a list together of what you expect that person to accomplish in the first 6 months or in the first year, so that you also have a basis for evaluating their performance. I often, as a consultant, because I take part in the Thrive phase, I will meet with the executive director new to the job several times and have a confidential conversation about how the job feels. Do they feel there's any way in which they're not really professionally prepared? Do they need some assistance? Is there something that they would not feel comfortable saying to the board that they would like to say to me so I can help? You want to ensure that they have a comfortable relationship with the staff. And sometimes we do a new leader assimilation process where you have the staff get together with the new leader and anonymously ask the questions they really want to know. And sometimes it will be, what are your hobbies? What do you do for fun? Tell us about your family. You know, and because it's anonymous, staff can ask whatever they like, and the executive director has an understanding of what they want to know, which helps. And I think that bonding time, the first few weeks, the bonding time between the new executive director and the board, the new executive director and the staff, and the way they connect with the community are all so critical to their success in the position that it's really important that you kind of choreograph those first few weeks in a way to ensure that they are comfortable in the job. Doesn't always happen. You know, sometimes it's not the right job for them and they don't find out until they're there, but you can do the best you can to help them accommodate to the job and learn whether it's the best job for them. Anybody have anything else they want to add to those things?
Not add to, but I have a question regarding just about an all volunteer organization, which is after listening to the things that we need to do. And it seems though, even though we are volunteers, we still, and one question naturally would be money, but is there other areas in the, like the Hartford Foundation to like give trainings and stuff on how we would go about that? Because we're really a volunteer organization. So we couldn't hire a consultant. We're not in that place like that, but we need different steps, succession plan. We need that. We need definitely clear responsibilities and duties of our executive director. We need that, but I know that's on the board to come up with that. But it seems like some of these steps would be hard to do if you're a volunteer organization.
Yeah. I don't know, Yvette, if you want to talk to the question about the foundation.
Sure, I think offering so that you hear the content, right, Rosalind? I think we talked about this earlier, is that typically these are issues, steps, things to plan for, whether you have staff or not. All volunteer organizations, while they might not have paid staff, have the same structures, have the same, have a programmatic impact they want to achieve, have a board that is overseeing it. So I want to say that most of these, this topic transcends whether it's a paid staff or not, in terms of the function of who's acting like the ED. Someone may very well have that role and is a volunteer. So we do have ongoing support, and I can, share more about that in my closing remarks. But if there is a support that organizations need, whether on this call or not, they can always reach out to the Hartford Foundation to hear specifically what might be available for them or in the area. But this series and others, other sessions within this nonprofit workshop series is really meant to be broad enough that it could be applicable for an all volunteer organization.
Yeah, thanks for the question, Rosalind. And I think it's true that no matter whether you're all volunteer or not, you, as you said, you really have tasks that have to be done. And if it's your board that does them, that's where the responsibility lies.
And it just means that people that are doing even the volunteer work have to be very committed to the mission and the vision.
Yeah, for sure.
It has to be almost like a job.
There was a question in the chat box about probationary periods. Do you recommend a probationary period for a new hire? And I think that I don't think it's a great idea to sort of call it a probationary period, but I think almost everybody knows the first 3 months on a job are very telling, both for the new hire and for the organization as to whether it works out or it doesn't. It's a little tricky if you have somebody who's made a major move to be in the geographic area where you are. And, you really do want to sort of extend that period of time a bit to make sure if it's, the first 3 months aren't going well, maybe you wait 6 months and you see if things can be remedied, whatever's not going well. But, it's a big job to find the right person and to hire them and bring them into the organization. And you don't want to have to do it again unless you have to. So, I always tell search committees, let's make sure we do it right this time, because you do not want to do this again a year from now. It just is much too time consuming, much too laborious and difficult and expensive. So you want to really come up with the right person and make sure that they really want the position. I think we should go on to the next slide, which we'll talk about how things can go wrong, which I think is also important. And you can be sure that, things go wrong sometimes. Not that there isn't a way to remedy them, but the way that things can go wrong are sometimes the candidate pool is just not what you had hoped it would be. It's not strong enough. You might identify the first choice finalist. You might be all excited about having come up with this person who's just the perfect person, and they might find that your organization is not their first choice and they take another job. The salary may not be acceptable to your finalist of choice. And even though we really like to make the salary level very clear to people when they're hired or when they're in that finalist category, sometimes they decide they have another offer that's a little bit richer for them, and they would like you to come up to that range, and it's a little bit tricky, but salary may be an issue. The board and search committee might prefer different finalists. So the search committee recommends their top finalist choice, and the board says, no, we want the other person. And so sometimes that requires a bit more work. Then the new ED begins work, but finds it's not the right job for them. It's not a good match. So moving on to the next slide, we're going to talk about what we do about these situations. How do we prevent or handle these obstacles? So if it's a weak candidate pool, we go back out and we actually start the process again, and we begin to look at other job sites, other individuals, other organizations, other alumni associations, whatever we can to sort of stretch that candidate information process out further to try to get a candidate pool that better matches the qualifications we're looking for. If the finalist takes another offer, sometimes you go back to the drawing board and consider the other finalists and see whether in fact there's somebody you liked almost as well, who could do the job really well, but who's very happy with the salary and the conditions. And maybe you identify new candidates who have come in since you actually identified your finalists, because once these job postings are out, the process is continual. People keep applying. And so you're always getting new candidates, and you can go and look at another candidate and begin that interview process again with new candidates. The salary being unacceptable, sometimes you alter the benefit package. Sometimes you alter the salary to keep the most ideal finalist, the person you really want, who you feel can take the organization to the next level, is sometimes worth changing your salary structure a little bit. Some of the issues that come up with that are your staff may not be comfortable with that. If you have staff who are being underpaid and you begin to pay your executive director way above what the former executive director got, staff kind of know, and they become a little bit wary of that, and it can impact the relationship they have with the executive director. But one executive search recently that I did, where we knew that the finalist we wanted to hire had another offer that was considerably more, but they were weighing both. We decided to make the benefit package richer, and so we offered unlimited paid time off. And that was the key that made the deal. And I think that this was a person we knew was so conscientious, there was no way they weren't going to do the job well. So the unlimited paid time off was not going to be a problem for them, and it's worked out well so far. So when the board and the search committee prefer different finalists, it's a real discussion point. And there was one situation I had where I did a search and we had two terrific finalists, one of whom had the experience and one of whom had the kind of celebrity status that people loved. And we felt the experience outweighed the celebrity status, but in fact, the board loved the celebrity status. They ended up hiring the person with the sheen of celebrity. And 6 months later, that person left and they ended up still being able to hire the person we had identified with the experience. So it's a little tricky and the board makes the ultimate decision. So a search committee or a search consultant really can't leverage that too strongly. The board has to live with that decision. And so in this case, they made the choice. It turned out not to be the right choice. They were able to remedy it and it was okay. If the new ED begins work, but it's not a good match, it can be for a number of reasons. And sometimes it's because there were undisclosed landmines. Sometimes you can prevent that from happening by having the candidates meet with the executive director and really get a full picture of what's going on in the organization. You never withhold information that's important, even if it's a difficult issue that's going to need a lot of attention. It's better for them to be prepared before they walk into that job. It's very easy to sort of make everything look neat and tidy and shiny for the new person, but it doesn't do you well in the end. They have to be treated with enormous honesty about what the position really holds. So the next slide. Where from here? Who are the best advocates for succession planning in your organization? These are probably questions you're going to want to ask yourself at this time if you hope to incorporate succession planning into your organization. Not only who are the best advocates, but who can introduce the idea of bench strength and shared leadership. And when strategic planning or annual planning takes place, who might incorporate succession planning? Sometimes you consider a staff or board retreat to share these ideas across the organization. As I said earlier, you may not be the person who can make the decision, but you might be able to identify who needs to have this message and who needs to begin thinking about this so that they can initiate the process. Next slide. So what are the basic steps to create an emergency succession plan, which might be your first step? These are the 5 steps that are indicated for creating an emergency succession plan. The board begins by evaluating internal competencies for assuming key tasks. Someone in the organization, likely the communications director, creates an emergency communications plan and decides who will implement it. The executive director, along with the board, identifies the internal functional areas that would need to be handled in an emergency situation. And we've talked about some of those. The board considers whether an external interim leader is needed or whether you have somebody inside who can do that. And then the board determines whether an executive search is warranted and either starts the process or hires an outside consultant to do that. Some of these may not be determined at the time. Some of these, need to be determined at the time of the emergency. You can't necessarily answer these questions all in advance. But preparation in advance means having these issues top of mind earlier. So that's the point for that. On the next page, next slide, we have additional resources. Since we've had a limited time period to cover a pretty complex subject, I've offered a few links to some articles that might be of interest, which will give you some different perspectives on succession planning and executive searches. So please check them out if you have the chance. And what I'd like to do is see if there are other questions people have across the presentation, anything that somebody would like to share.
Sure. Well, people use the raise hand feature. I'll flag a couple here in the chat, Cathy. Dwayne asked, do you recommend hiring with, oh, we did that one. I'm sorry, Dwayne. Sonja Hall wrote, would a 1 to 2 year contract be advisable?
For an incoming executive director, I'm assuming you're talking about. You know, I am familiar, I think in Connecticut and in Massachusetts, there really is no, there's no contracting necessary, really. You are kind of at will. And so you are, you know, you're basically hired with the idea that either the organization or the individual can change the relationship anytime. I don't know that contracts do you much good, but certainly 1 to 2 years is not enough to get a really top-notch candidate to make a major change in their lives to come. So I don't know that 2 years would be enough to warrant, you know, a person that you want to hire coming. So I'd say if you're going to make a contract of any kind, it would probably need to be longer than 2 years.
I don't think I have any other questions in the chat.
Any questions at all on any part of this? When you think about your own organization, are there things that come to mind that are coming up that are problematic for you, or that you feel would sort of require rethinking some of this?
For me, it's not rethinking, it's things that we have to put in place. Definitely the emergency succession plan and detailed responsibilities for our executive director. And we just have a lot of work to do because we have been strictly volunteer. So now we're trying to pull together, be more organized, be more structured. But I believe we're going to get there.
Yeah. I will say, Rosalind, that one organization that I worked with that was all volunteer hired one of their board members as a part-time staff person to basically be a kind of management person. And sometimes if you look towards that and seek funding for that, you know, it's being a little strategic about what you hope to accomplish and seeking funding for where you're headed. That can help too.
Thank you.
Any other questions at all? Well, I will turn this over to you, Yvette, if we have no more questions.
Unmute. I don't see any other questions, but I guess now is a good time to wrap it up. I want to personally thank you, Cathy, on behalf of our team. Thank you for coming and presenting on this super important topic affecting lots of nonprofits right now in real time, right? We see a lot of transitions happening. So we hope that this presentation, the materials and the content and the resources that Cathy has flagged, you know, prove to be helpful in your own planning, whether it's planned or inevitable or emergency, that we hope that it proves to be helpful to you and your organizations to maintain continuity for the important work that you do every day. Betsy has posted a link to a brief survey. Please take a moment to share your thoughts. Let us know how to improve, what you liked, what you'd like to see hopefully in the future in terms of content. We do read those as a team. The slide presentation will be shared. Daniel will be sending the slide deck along with the link to the recording for today's session and the link for the survey, just in case you didn't do it right now, in an email right after the presentation. So look out for your email. Our next workshop in the workshop series is Strategic Visioning. Create the future you want for your organization. The presenter will be Roosevelt Smith, and that will happen Wednesday, exactly a week from today, Wednesday, November 17th from 11:30 to 1:30. Please visit the Hartford Public Library website to register for that session if you're interested. We hope to see you, our repeat customers there again. It was lovely to see you today. If you're interested in hearing what other capacity building supports might be available through the Hartford Foundation for Public Giving, our capacity building unit, and nonprofit support program, please reach out to me. My email, and I'll put it in the chat now, actually, while I'm speaking, and you'll see it. You can email me. Let's see, where's my chat? It disappeared. Hold on a second. This is all live, folks. All right. Yeah, please email me and we could set up a time to talk one-on-one about who you are, what you're doing, and I'll help as much as I can to strategize what resources might make the most sense, whether they're the Hartford Foundation for Public Givings or another capacity building partner in our region. So we're here to help you with that. If there are no more questions, I think we can call it a completed session. Thank you so much again, Cathy, for being here. Thank you, everyone, for being here.
Thanks to everyone.